And so today I am joined by a wonderful group of panelists. And with me today is Jeanette Doran. She is the president and chief counsel for the North Carolina Institute on Constitutional Law. I have Corey DeAngelis. He is the director of school choice at Reason Foundation, as well as an adjunct scholar at Cato Institute. And Civitas's own Dr. Bob Luebke, who is the director of policy here at Civitas. So thank you all for joining us today, and very, very glad to have you here. So we are going to kick this off, and at the end, just so you all know, we will have questions and answers at the end. I will be toggling back and forth to my Facebook on my desktop, so I will be reviewing your questions there. So don't think that we have forgotten you or are ignoring any of them. We will make sure we get to those at the end. But first, we wanted to kind of give all of you a lay of the land and talk really kind of about what's going on here in North Carolina, specifically as it pertains to the scholarship. So Jeanette, I would love for you to give us a brief background of this lawsuit, the main actors behind it, and let us know, why is this problematic and concerning?
Well, first, let me thank you and all of Civitas for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to get out information to parents and citizens across the state about not just this lawsuit, but how this is part of a broader assault on school choice and the rights of parents. So this particular case, which was filed by 7 parents against the state and the state agency that administers the Opportunity Scholarship Program, that's called the State Education Assistance Authority. The plaintiffs, and this is important to understand, the lead plaintiff is a woman named Tamika Walker Kelly, and she is president of the teachers union. What they've done in this lawsuit is they've raised 3 basic legal arguments to the Opportunity Scholarship Program, the way it's been implemented. And the first is they're claiming that the Opportunity Scholarships, that the way the program is run discriminates on the basis of religion and the rights of conscience. Their second argument is that giving public money through the scholarship program to private schools does not accomplish a public purpose. And then finally, they're claiming that because the schools aren't subject to the same kind of accountability standards and metrics that public schools are, that the program is arbitrary and capricious and unconstitutional. None of those arguments are really very valid. In fact, they're not remotely valid as far as I'm concerned. But this is, again, part of a larger attack on the right of parents, particularly in this case, we're talking about the Opportunity Scholarship Program, and the only students who are eligible for that are students who are coming from really very modest economic means. So there is a financial ceiling, and this lawsuit takes aim at really children, poor kids, for lack of a better expression.
Right. Well, and I believe on your website, you described this as just a meritless lawsuit. I think that's pretty direct. And I know we're going to unpack why you believe it to be meritless even further on, but you gave us a good survey of that. But going back to the Opportunity Scholarship and what that is, Bob, can you let the audience know, and then just anyone that maybe we've got some legislators that are watching, and remind them of what the Opportunity Scholarship Program is and why it's important to families in North Carolina.
Sure. The Opportunity Scholarship Program was passed by the legislature in 2013. The program was launched in 2014, and what it is, it's basically provides an opportunity for low-income kids, many of whom are trapped in subpar schools, provides them an opportunity for a better education. Simply put, that's it. It does that by providing vouchers of up to $4,200 or 90% of tuition for kids to be used at a private school. To be eligible, you have to have a household income of not over 133% of the amount that a family would qualify for free and reduced lunch. Translate that, I mean, that basically means for a family of 4, about $64,000. Okay, the average grant for the program, I think last year was about $3,900. There are about 450 schools in North Carolina that participate in the program. And of those, about 80%, approximately 80% are religious schools, 20% are non-religious schools. Pertinent to what Jeanette was saying, when the program was approved, there was a constitutional challenge that was launched against it, and it was ruled constitutional. I won't get into all the details, but it was the constitutionality of it was upheld in 2015. Program moved forward. As I said, it started in 2014. It had an enrollment of about 1,200 kids. It's exploded in the last 6 years. Now has an enrollment of about 12,100 kids. So parents like it, kids like it. It does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is provide a lifeline for kids for a better education. It's very popular, and a lot of people wondering why this lawsuit is coming forward based on that.
And we're going to provide some analysis and some thoughts as to why that might be the case. But Corey, switching over to you, do you see other states that have similar programs? And if so, are they facing similar assaults? Is this something that's unique to North Carolina, or what's going on across the country?
Well, it's going on everywhere, but I just want to point out really quick that the reason for anyone to prevent families from choosing schools for their children is to protect a monopoly system. They want to keep these low-income families in schools that are not adequately meeting their needs. So that's the reason for this. And I just want to hit a couple of the quote unquote constitutional arguments against this are just bogus. They don't discriminate. The program doesn't discriminate on the basis of religion. You can get a scholarship regardless of your religious background or sexual orientation. So it doesn't discriminate based on religion, just like Pell Grants don't discriminate based on religion. You can take Pell Grants to religious or non-religious, private or public universities if you're choosing. Children can still choose to remain in their public schools even with this program. The public money going to serving a public benefit argument is absolutely ridiculous here. Obviously, getting a better education serves a public benefit. And imagine if people were arguing like the teachers unions are arguing in North Carolina, that public dollars must go to public institutions with a lot of other programs like Pell Grants. First of all, like I already mentioned, they can be used at private institutions. Pre-K programs, those dollars go to families, and families can pick public or private providers of pre-K services. Food stamps, you can use those at a whole host of different private providers of groceries like Walmart, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's. So this whole public dollars, public schools thing is just a pretty ridiculous argument if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, especially when the private schools are doing a better job at providing a good education. This whole accountability argument, Bob already kind of touched on this, but the private schools are directly accountable to the families. If they aren't, families can vote with their feet and take their money elsewhere, unlike the traditional public schools. Why are so many families, 12,000 families in North Carolina, leaving the public schools if the public schools are quote unquote more accountable than the private schools? The reality is that they're not, because they're a monopoly, and monopolies aren't accountable to individual families. So, okay, I just had to hit those really quickly, but there's so much of this going on in other states as well. It's not the same kind of attacks that we're seeing here in North Carolina. I think it's especially egregious here to attack a program targeted to the least advantaged students in North Carolina. So this is kind of worse than usual, but we are also seeing things in the charter school sector as well. In places like Pennsylvania and California and Oregon, the teachers unions actually lobbied to prevent families from having their education dollars follow them to charter schools, which in any other year would have been fine, that you could have enrolled in the charter school sector. So in California, for example, since the money's not following the child as a result of Senate Bill 98 out there that they just passed, one charter school in particular reported that they had to put 500 already admitted students back on the wait list. So there's a court case coming out in California in support of the families, responding to this Senate bill that prevented the dollars from following the students. Oregon Teachers Union did the same thing, lobbied to make it illegal to enroll in virtual charter schools. Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Association for School Administrators explicitly mentioned that they were lobbying to do the same thing because they were fearful of losing money associated with children that would be switching to virtual charter schools in Pennsylvania. They didn't get exactly what they wanted. They got the next best thing, though, which prevented the dollars from following the child to the charter school of their choosing in Pennsylvania. So we're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing teachers unions protesting using, a lot of different morbid pictures, such as writing fake obituaries to their governors, using fake body bags as demonstrations, fake coffins, whole bunch of these protests to protest reopening schools. And so we're seeing this everywhere. And I think the main problem is that we're funding the system and not the students. If we gave the money to the families like you're doing in North Carolina with the Opportunity Scholarship Program, it wouldn't really matter if the school reopened or not, if a particular school reopened or not, because then you could take your children's education dollars elsewhere. If a Walmart doesn't reopen, you can take your grocery money elsewhere. Similarly, if your school doesn't reopen, you should be able to take your child's education dollars elsewhere.
So that just makes so much sense that, I mean, it's no wonder that we're actually not functioning that way, because everything's political now, right? And so, I mean, we politicize schools and our kids' education, yet we're not, politicizing food stamp money. But of course, that's a really good point. And actually, I think it highlights the fact that there are assaults going on everywhere. This is a political power play issue, and it's for the sake of preserving a monopoly.
Well, and you could really quickly, we know it's not so much about safety. When you look at the Brookings Institution, a left-leaning institution, a think tank analysis that did a correlation between COVID cases per capita and reopening decisions, there's no statistically significant relationship. I have another analysis replicating those findings, again, finding no relationship between COVID deaths per capita or COVID cases per capita and school district reopening decisions. But as Brookings found, it has much more to do with politics. And then on the ground, we've seen like the Los Angeles teachers unions fighting for things like defunding the police and tying that to reopening schools. We saw it in North Carolina. I think it was Durham. They called for, giving
Universal
income
healthcare
to immigrants and universal health care. And we saw Medicaid for all in proposals elsewhere. We saw 10 teachers unions band together with the Democratic Socialists of America a week or two ago and did a national day of resistance where they called for similar things and also called for banning their competition, charter schools and school choice programs.
Very problematic, I will say that. So, but let's pivot over. Jeanette, I've got another question for you regarding the state's constitutional role as it pertains to educating students. So where does the state, where's the state constitutionally obligated to enter into this discussion? And in your opinion, does the Opportunity Scholarship Program comply with that constitutional mandate?
There's no doubt that the Opportunity Scholarship Program is fully and completely consistent with the state constitution. The public school children, or the school-age children in North Carolina have a constitutional right to the opportunity for a sound basic education. That's been litigated and is still subject to litigation. But just because the public schools are required by the Constitution doesn't mean that that's the only opportunity that kids should have. So the Supreme Court has previously addressed the Opportunity Scholarship Program in what's known as a facial challenge. And in 2015, the plaintiffs wanted to stop the Opportunity Scholarship Program before it even got started. And they lost at the Supreme Court in a very narrow 4-3 decision. Now they're looking and they're suing over how it's been applied, and they're claiming that it discriminates on the basis of gender identity and religion. And the problem with that is multifold. Your first problem is the scholarships, where they get used, is up to the parents, not up to government. And as a factual matter, I think it fails because these scholarships are being used in a number of schools that are not religiously affiliated. And there's really no way for the plaintiffs in this most recent attack on the program to sidestep that. I mean, the fact is about 10% of the schools participating in Opportunity Scholarship programs are not religious schools. And fundamentally, it's up to the parents to decide whether to apply for the program and if they're eligible, which school to send their child to. I think this sort of attack on the program is, as I've said a few times, it's an attack on the right, not just of the students to get the education that's best suited to them, but it's really an assault on families, on parents being the ones to make that decision. And that, that is also relevant when we're talking about the third part of the lawsuit, where the plaintiffs are complaining that the schools aren't subject to the same accountability standards that public schools are. Well, they're accountable, but they're accountable not to government bureaucrats, but to parents. Well, who has the biggest skin in the game? Parents, families, the children, not bureaucrats. And I say that not just as a constitutional law attorney, but I say that as a mom. Parents are the ones that are most familiar with their child's particular needs, and they are most likely to be involved in a day-to-day basis on what works for their children. And this is just a sign that the teachers union and left-wing activists are out there pushing hard and heavy to prevent families from making the right decision for their children and put all of that power in the monopoly of bureaucracy.
That I think that's really at the crux of this. Like you mentioned, it's the families. It's an assault on the families. Is this really about kids? Because if it is, we're going to empower their parents with choice. And so I love that. And as a fellow mother, I'm there with you. This hits close to home. I want my kids I want to have autonomy and at least a semblance of say over my children's education at the very least, but certainly autonomy, I think, is the ideal when it comes to a parent's role in determining the best education for their children as they're able to pursue maybe just options that work best with their kids' unique needs. And go ahead, Jeanette.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things that's really scary, and I think this is particularly relevant this year because we have so many Supreme Court races on the ballot in November. In that 2015 case, there was a dissent that was written by Justice Hudson, but it was joined by Ervin and now Chief Justice Beasley, who is running for election this fall. And in that, when it came to this question about accountability, the dissenters wrote that accountability couldn't be left to what they described as the whims of the marketplace. Parenting isn't a whim of the marketplace. It's a constitutional right, but it's also, I think, every parent's most important focus and duty. And to consider that we had 3 out of 7 justices diminish that and describe it as a whim of the marketplace, that should scare voters.
It's insulting, to be honest, as a parent.
Yes.
To have my role viewed in such a manner by bureaucrats. But Bob, I'm going to pivot over to you now, mixing it up a little bit. I know this is a little different than our notes, but I wanted to have you follow up on what Jeanette mentioned about the families. And I know in all of your work in the state of North Carolina on this front that you have talked to many families, and some of them are recipients of the Opportunity Scholarship. So I just wanted you to maybe give our audience a general sense of who these families are, what their concerns are, what motivates them. So could you just provide a little bit of insight based on your own experiences?
Yeah, my interaction with families is probably similar to other people that have actually reached out and talked to people who have kids in the program. And one thing that you run into constantly is just the gratefulness of people who've had the opportunity to actually get a scholarship, and oftentimes how it's life-changing. I know we have a January luncheon, usually during school choice week. And this past year, we had 2 moms talk about that very thing, about how the scholarship changed not only that child's life, but basically the life of the family, and how one child's school experience was adversely affecting family dynamics, but how revolutionary and how real it can be that we talk about how schools can change lives, can change the arc of your life, and it really does. The gratefulness, people usually perform better academically when they get into an environment that is best suited for them. The parents know that, what their academic style is of their child, what their learning style is. It's usually a smaller environment. And we know that about 2 years ago, I believe, there was a report that came out that 94% of parents that were surveyed in the program said that they would rank their child's academic program as either an A or a B. So the parents are really satisfied with the program. I mean, that's obviously contributed to growth. It's contributed to demand. You know, it's why the program is growing, but there's immense parental satisfaction, and that's helping to beat down the doors and increase demand, which is exactly what we want, which is for kids to have an opportunity for better education.
Well, I mean, it's just baffling for someone to try to come out and make the argument that the schools that everybody's fighting really hard to leave, to exit, and the schools that are fighting to prevent families, particularly low-income families, from leaving, those are somehow the more accountable ones. Like, just come on, give me a break. That just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the private schools are the ones that families are seeking out. They're obviously more accountable to the needs of the individual families. So I think it's just weird confusion with top-down regulations with quote unquote accountability. Just, you know, having a certain regulation in place and checking a box doesn't mean you're actually producing good educational outcomes for students. And it doesn't mean that families are satisfied with the education or lack thereof of education being provided to families and their students. So I think Bob hits the nail on the head that families are very satisfied with the North Carolina Opportunity Scholarship Program. That's why over 12,000 families are using it. And that's why they're opting out of their government-run school voluntarily and knowing that they're only getting about 40% of the funding that they would have gotten for their children in the traditional public school system. So how is the school system that people are leaving and leaving $6,000 behind somehow more accountable to these families that are voluntarily leaving? It's just, I just got to point out, it's just a ridiculous argument to make.
Well, and if I may jump in on that point, think about this. There's an allegation in the lawsuit where one of the plaintiffs claims that there is not a single public school in her county that has the resources to assist her special needs child. In the entire public school system of that county, she says she can't find a single public school to help her special needs child. That in and of itself is an indictment of the public school industry. And she, again, according to the lawsuit, found a public school in a neighboring county. But if public schools are all that in a bag of chips, then she'd be able to find a public school in her home county.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, a similar argument she's making is that, you know, she doesn't have a non-religious private school in her area, but that's akin to saying that Pell Grants are unconstitutional overall just because one particular family may live in a community where there isn't a non-religious private university. That most people would think that would be absolutely ridiculous to say that the overall Pell Grant program is unconstitutional and discriminates on the basis of religion, which in reality it doesn't, because you can get a Pell Grant regardless of your religious background or your gender identity. But just because there's one family that lives in an area in a small town that doesn't have a non-religious private school, that obviously wouldn't make Pell Grants overall unconstitutional. Similarly, the North Carolina Opportunity Scholarship isn't unconstitutional overall just because of this one situation in a particular town.
So Corey, you a moment ago had mentioned top-down regulations, and of course my mind immediately went to the federal government. And so this next question is related to that. So President Trump recently said that school choice is essentially a civil rights issue. And knowing your work there at Reason and at Cato, I know that you are someone who likes to hold the federal government accountable and make sure they stay in their lane. So I'm curious, what is the federal government's role in education?
Well, the federal government doesn't have a role in education. That's a softball question. The word education isn't in the Constitution. But before I get to that, I want to point out really quickly that the argument about this program in North Carolina is that it somehow discriminates on religion or or sexual orientation of the students, but tell that to the individual students who are using school choice programs who happen to be LGBTQ that overwhelmingly benefit from attending a school of choice. Taking away LGBTQ students' options does not help LGBTQ students. It does the opposite. Just look in Florida, Elijah, a student out there was a story in the Washington Examiner. He said that the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program saved his life because he was getting bullied on such a constant basis in the public school system. And how are you going to tell a student that somehow taking away his option to go to a religious or non-religious private school where he's reports that it actually saved his life is somehow good for him to prevent him from having that, him or her, or they from having that option? It's just totally ridiculous. And there's actually a survey by GLSEN that came out in 2017, a nationally representative survey, or at least a national survey, that found that LGBTQ students in private schools reported that they were that had better experiences in their schools than the LGBTQ students in public schools. So the data show that using these programs is a benefit, and having options is a benefit for these students as well. But look, I don't think the federal government has a role in education, I also understand that we currently have federal government involved in education. So given the situation we have with 8% of funding coming from the federal government in K-12 education, I think a step in the right direction would be to have that funding go to individual families instead of government institutions. So you can still be a libertarian and support a move at the federal level, which would empower more families to have educational options. So I'm looking at you, Rand Paul, U.S. Senator from Kentucky, who just introduced recently the School Act, which would take nearly all federal existing dollars in the school system, which happens to be around $60 to $70 billion on an annual basis, and would allow those dollars to follow children instead of government institutions. The families would still have the choice to stay in the public school system, so the dollars still could remain in the public school system if the public school is actually providing a meaningful education. But in his bill, it would also allow these families to use the money at a private school, or even a homeschool option as well. So it's essentially an education savings account. And I think that is a step in the right direction towards funding students instead of systems. And I just got to point out again, there's almost no other taxpayer funded initiative that I can think of that sets up funding the way that we set up funding in the K-12 education system. In the K-12 education system, the norm is that the money goes to the building and the system regardless of the choice of the family. But with food stamps, Pell Grants, pre-K programs, Section 8 housing vouchers, Medicaid, Social Security dollars even, if you're going to have that taxpayer funding for those initiatives, the funding goes to the person. And we should do the same thing in K-12 education. It's just completely bonkers that the money is somehow owed to the institution rather than the individual. The money is supposed to be meant for educating the child. It should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education, just like with these other programs.
Well, Bob, Corey mentioned education savings accounts there a moment ago, and North Carolina, that's one of the ways in which we have expanded school choice. And so I know that we have made a lot of strides over the past decade in particular, but what I wanted to hear from you, Bob, was what's the sense on the ground? What's the public opinion on this? I know Civitas, we have polled this multiple times. Every January, we do a special school choice poll. But can you unpack that a little bit and give us some insights as to where the electorate is at on this?
Yeah, many of you know that we poll monthly on a variety of issues, school choice being one of them that we frequently poll on, and we've been polling since 2005 on ed choice issues, probably a lot in the last decade. And as I've reviewed just for this talk here, I mean, there's three things. I mean, if you look at our polling, it really comes down, you get three conclusions out of it. North Carolina has supported school choice for a long time and has supported it in high numbers, okay? It has supported the idea of choice and choice programs. And there's also, a discontent with the existing options, okay? So let me just kind of unpack that a little bit with, in January, we polled on questions that we frequently poll annually. And one of them is always, we ask if you agree or you disagree with the statement that parents should be able to determine where their child attends school. This year, 81% of our respondents agreed with that statement. That's a very high number. It's been very high every time we've asked it that. It's sometimes been in the mid 80s, maybe as low as probably the high 70s, but that's a number you seldom see in polling. But it's indicative of obviously philosophical agreement with the concept that parents should control education. Then also I talked about a discontent with current education options. We always ask the question also, if money wasn't an impediment, and if you could choose the best school for your children, where would you send them? Just parenthetically, currently 80% of kids go to public schools. Now that response, what we got back was basically 65% of respondents would send their child either to a private school, a charter school, or a home school. I mean, that's the three combined. But the point is almost 2/3 of respondents want to be elsewhere. Okay, so there's that disconnect between what exists and where parents want their kids to be. Those numbers, this year it was 65%, have been anywhere from the high 50s to 66, 67% in the last 10 years. So that, again, indicative of discontent. And then lastly, for the current programs, we poll on, charter schools, how people feel about charter schools and the Opportunity Scholarship. Charter schools, 58% of people agreed and supported charter schools, 22% opposed them. And then even with the Opportunity Scholarship, a little higher public support there, 67%, 2/3 of respondents supported, and about almost a little less than a quarter oppose it. Those numbers, again, traditionally, they're about where they have been historically over the last 10 years. Opportunity Scholarship, again, what we're talking about, it's got a public support rate of about 2/3 of the population. That's high. That's very high, indicative of the fact that parents like it, the public likes the idea, it's a popular program, and we need to take that into consideration. So
I just want to add
follow up on that.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Jeanette.
I was just going to follow up on that because I think those sorts of numbers are relevant to the public purpose analysis. As I mentioned, one of the claims in the lawsuit is it's using public money on scholarships for students who attend a private school does not accomplish public purpose. And the state constitution has specific clauses that restrict the use of the power of taxation or appropriation so that they can only be used to accomplish public purpose. Well, the Supreme Court has long recognized that education is a public purpose. And there's a two-part test to that public purpose analysis. And Brooke, I'm happy to get into that if you'd like, or I can stay out of the weeds there. But suffice it to say, the court has long recognized how important education is to society as a whole, not just parents, but to society as a whole, because the benefit of education inures to the public as a whole. Now, this happens to be one way of furthering education for children. And in the context of the Opportunity Scholarship Program, we're talking about lower income children who are generally also considered to be at risk, which is another component to these discussions. But one of the most important parts of what government does is facilitate the education of the next generation of our citizenry. And this is one way to accomplish that. But that's why it polls so highly, is because everyone, almost without exception, recognizes how important education is and that our children are our most valuable asset.
We should also realize that some of the highest levels of support are amongst minority parents, many of whom obviously have skin in the game with kids. They've been through the program and so forth. that's a relevant part of this whole discussion too. So.
Yeah, I just want to add, the public benefit here is a well-educated populace. You might as well let the families actually choose schools that are going to educate them so you can achieve that public benefit of a well-educated populace, because it's not happening in the public school system for far too many students, and preventing them from having, for these families and these students from having options does not achieve a public benefit of an educated populace if it results in a monopoly that doesn't have any strong incentives to actually provide that adequate education. So, this whole public benefit argument is totally bonkers. But I just wanted to point out, some additional data to what Bob said. With it's really, telling that when you ask families where they want to send their children, about half of them in the public school system say they want to do something different. And that's why you have groups fighting from allowing families to get what they want, because they know that they're going to have half empty schools. There'll be a mass exodus from the public school system. And look, the monopoly hasn't had to compete for far too long. And they know if they allow families to leave, there will be a lot of families that choose to leave voluntarily, despite getting a fraction of the education dollars that would have been spent on their children in the public school system. But AFC did similar polling on this as well, where they asked the same question. And so this result is consistent over time and between different survey administrators, that about 40% say that they would still choose public schools, but then the other 40 to 42% said that they would want to choose private, charter, or homeschools if they had a free option. So I think that's why we're seeing so much pushback. And this is the real reason why there's so much of a political fight against allowing education dollars to follow students to wherever they're getting an education, wherever their children, their families want them to get a good education. I mean, look, it would be totally ridiculous to say that the public benefit of food stamps, for example, is having, people who wouldn't otherwise, get a good nutritious meal or food just in general, allow them to get that meal. And that can be provided through private providers of the service as well. Just imagine how absurd it would be to say that taxpayer funding for food stamps, if you're going to be using that program, you have to use it at a residentially assigned government-run grocery store. Most people would see that as a huge infringement on individual liberties. That those grocery stores, for example, also probably would have expired food, rotten food on the shelves. They wouldn't have a lot of options that would cater to the needs of individual, groups like kosher foods, for example. They wouldn't have all these options. And most people would think that would be ridiculous. And we need to have a mind shift when it comes to K-12 education too, that it's also absolutely ridiculous to force low-income families to use their children's education dollars at residentially assigned government schools. That's just, you should still be able to pick that if you want, but it's totally ridiculous to have that be the only option for low-income families.
Well, it's especially alarming these days where we've got schools like the Durham public school system announced plans to operate, they were going to all virtual schools, but for $140 a week per student, you could send your kid to a learning center. And even the poorest of the students, those on free lunch, it was going to be $70. It's going to be $70 a week. Well, do those kids not matter?
I mean, that's
yeah,
the
but
real
to underscore that point, I mean, even the public schools, if you go pre-K, they'll give you a voucher.
Yeah.
To get go to a private pre-K program. Higher ed, you can go to a private institution, a public institution, if you take federal funding. So, but it just shows you K-12 is the outlier. It's the outlier and it's the exception to everything.
I mean, it's the exception for one reason. It's because there's an entrenched monopoly system that gets your money regardless. And the norm in higher ed and pre-K is that people can choose already.
That's
and
right.
that the money follows the person. But the norm in K through 12 is you have the special interest that gets your money regardless of your individual choice. And that's the problem here. And that's why there's a logical inconsistency, or an apparent logical inconsistency, when it comes to these different levels of education. You should be for choice when it comes to everybody's education, regardless of pre-K, K through 12, or higher education. And what Jeanette said really quickly, The real constitutional issue is not the voucher program in North Carolina. It's the Durham public school system charging families for something that's supposed to be quote unquote free or taxpayer funded. They're charging $140 per child per week. And it's almost like extortion. If this was in the private sector, if a private school took your tuition money, let's say it's $10,000 per year, and said, oh, we're not reopening because it's not safe, but hey, we'll reopen actually and call it daycare if you give us another $10,000, but we're not going to give you your initial money back, people would call that extortion, and rightly so, because they would be using that power dynamic to get an additional $10,000 from you. We should similarly think about K-12 education that way. And look, in North Carolina, the Constitution says they have to have a free public education. Well, you can't say you're doing that if you're charging families twice, once to the property tax system and then once out of pocket. That's totally reprehensible that they're doing that. It should be free, and it should be, well, at least taxpayer funded, if that's what, you know, they should use the existing funding that's already existing in the K-12 school system. And look, if the schools aren't reopening, it's kind of hard for them to say that they're providing their constitutional obligation to provide, you know, a 9-month school year, a public school system, because schooling is generally understood to be an in-person situation where one of the main benefits of that is the childcare services being provided to families. And they're not doing that this year. That's the bigger constitutional issue I see in North Carolina and elsewhere. We're seeing it happen in other states too.
So I want to get a little bit into the nitty gritty of this particular lawsuit. These are all just great comments, and I think it's helpful for us to switch our paradigm in terms of how we look at K-12 education. And so pointing out that cognitive dissonance that so many hold in terms of Pell Grants and Head Start programs versus the K-12 system, I think is really essential to helping the public understand. But like you all mentioned, the polling indicates the public gets this need for choice. They understand it a lot. But one of the lawsuit's claims is, I'm going to read it right here, voucher schools can be operated by inexperienced and unaccredited institutions, can hire unqualified and unsafe teachers and employees, can teach using haphazard and unproven methods, and can fail to improve student knowledge and performance in any measurable way. So, Bob, what do you make of these claims? And when compared to public schools, do private schools have a track record of employing unsafe teachers and staff? Tell me what the data says.
Well, you got a lot to unpack there. Let's start with the first statements you were talking about, which are basically a rant, and reflects the public schools' intent to have private schools knuckle under their form of accountability, and it's just not acceptable. There are different ways for programs to be accountable. And in the Opportunity Scholarship Program, there are requirements that schools have, and parents primarily determine, whether or not their children are getting a good education by deciding whether or not they're going to enroll. There are other examples, et cetera. But I'm not sold at all on what they bring up as far as certification and accreditation. Certification, if you take those requirements, some of the best college professors at UNC or Duke would not be allowed in a classroom. We know that because they don't meet the absurd requirements, of what they need to get in school. Okay, that's oftentimes designed to keep people out. Okay, we all know that. Then with regards also to accreditation, how valuable is that? Some of the best schools in North Carolina are not accredited. Some of the worst were accredited. What difference did that make? There are other ways of ensuring quality education, and private schools have done many things to ensure that quality programs are delivered. You talked about unsafe teachers in the classroom and so forth. I mean, there's anecdotal evidence that can be referred to in any of these cases, and they've been brought up, and nobody's supporting, having unsafe teachers, in the classroom. Everyone supports whatever legal process has to be gone through. I was a little surprised that the NCAE and other public schools brought that up, knowing that I think it was 2 years ago when USA Today gave North Carolina an F, on its system for teacher background checks, and how still to this day that system has not been corrected. And anybody who reads a newspaper or any of the local news around here knows it's criminal how often teachers are found, or are alleged to have, involved themselves with students. And that's a result of the fact that we don't have a good system for checking on that. So in nowhere, I can't sit here and deny that it never happens, but I'd say it's nowhere near what the safety problems are in the public schools. So that's
just really
I'm
quick.
deeply surprised that they raised that.
I think we need to just stop calling these regulations accountability. All they are just box checking regulations. Government regulations are not the same thing as accountability. And I would argue the only true form of accountability is allowing people to vote with their feet and take their money elsewhere if they're not being served adequately by that institution. You can have as many government regulations as you want. That's not going to guarantee any
Right.
meaningful outcomes for children. So, and then look, I thought that the North Carolina Opportunity Scholarship required the schools to have some form of accreditation, but I'm with you, Bob, that accreditation doesn't actually lead to better outcomes. And if it did, then families would choose schools that are accredited if that is actually meaningful to them. And I meant to mention this earlier, but there's only one peer-reviewed study on the North Carolina Opportunity Scholarship Program done by Anna Egalite and her team at NC State University, and it's at AERA Open if you want to go check it out. They found large positive effects, about a third of a standard deviation positive effects on math scores and language arts scores after controlling for a whole host of different characteristics of the students. It's not a random assignment study, but it's the best study we have on the topic. And it's the only one finding large, despite getting only 40% of the funding that the public schools are getting. And there's one more study I wanted to cite really quickly, which is by Andrew McEachen and his team over at RAND. It's published in Economics of Education Review, I want to say, but it's a peer-reviewed study, came out this year. They found that access to charter schools in North Carolina was associated with about a 30% reduction in felonies and misdemeanors, which goes along with all of the other studies. There's 5 other studies linking school choice to crime, all finding significant reductions in crime. So look, a lot of the benefits of school choice are not captured in a test score. It's a lot of these other safety mechanisms that Bob was kind of talking about, the benefits of having a safer school, a better culture, a better network that leads to better long-term outcomes as well. That's not always captured in a standardized test score.
So Corey, I'm gonna come right back to you on that actually, and just one more aspect of this, and then I'm gonna move over to Jeanette for the closing question before we turn to our audience. But another one of the complaints in this lawsuit is that these schools, these voucher schools, are not subject to open meeting laws. And so there's this expectation of transparency. And I think you've kind of answered it anyways, but go ahead and directly, should accreditation or open meeting laws be a requisite for institutions that receive taxpayer dollars?
No, and I'll just reiterate what I said a second ago, that these don't actually lead to better outcomes. And look, private schools have a real incentive to listen to their customers, the families. You can have all of these, open meetings and kind of public discussions, but the reality is, in the public school system, unless there's a true mechanism for holding these schools accountable, that is allowing people to vote with their feet and take their money with them, these meetings, these open meetings can be meaningless, that they could just say, oh yeah, we're listening, we're trying really hard, we're going to do the best we can, but then they don't actually improve over time. So we've had these public conversations in the public school system for a very long time, and it hasn't led to better outcomes. And that is because they don't really have an incentive to listen to the needs of families like they do in the private school sector. And I just want to point out that it was really laughable for the president of the NEA, the largest teachers union in the United States, Lily Eskelsen Garcia, which is also the largest labor union period in the United States, the National Education Association. She commented on this lawsuit in North Carolina, and she had the audacity to actually make the claim that private schools are unaccountable to parents. Usually they try to say it's unaccountable to public scrutiny or the public, but she actually made the claim that private schools are unaccountable to parents. Come on. Parents can take their money elsewhere, and the private schools have a very strong incentive to cater to the needs of the individual families, and individual families know that. That's why they are in large numbers, when given the option, flocking to the private school sector whenever they get the chance. And look, If the private schools weren't accountable to the parents, you wouldn't have teachers unions and other groups lobbying to force these families under using government force to prevent them from taking their children's education dollars elsewhere. The reality is the public schools are the ones that are unaccountable to them. And people's actions, thousands of low-income families' actions in North Carolina and elsewhere demonstrate that difference in true accountability.
So Jeanette, Corey uses that word action. That's what he's closing with. And that's kind of where we're going with this final question for you, which is free association. And so Plaintiff Howell in this lawsuit, she cites a lack of non-sectarian schools in her area as central to her claim of opposition to the Opportunity Scholarship Program. She suggests that that is unconstitutional, that she doesn't have access, in her words or her idea, to non-sectarian schools. So am I understanding her argument correctly? And how do you respond to that as an attorney?
I don't think it makes a lick of difference, to be honest. She still has the choice to send her children to a traditional public school in the area. She has the choice to look at private non-religious schools in adjacent counties. There are lots of options that she has, and the fact that she doesn't have the choice that she specifically wants does not kill the whole program, which is what they're trying to do. Just because you've got one person who doesn't get exactly what she wants doesn't mean that 12,000 school kids who depend on these scholarships for a decent quality education should have to suffer. There are just other options out there.
I mean, just think about this with Pell Grants too, right? If you live in a place that doesn't have a private non-religious community college, doesn't mean Pell Grants overall are unconstitutional. And with food stamps, I mean, someone could try to make the argument that, oh, my nearest Walmart in my location doesn't have kosher food, so therefore it's discriminating against my religion. That would be an absolutely ridiculous argument to try to take down all of food stamps or all of Pell Grants just because of these kind of outlier cases. And you're right, Jeanette, that people can choose other locations, then they could look in adjacent counties, and they could stay in the public school system. But the reality is the public school system isn't providing meaningful education.
So I've got a question here from the audience, and we're running out of time, so I want to make sure I get to this one, and whoever wants to answer it, or all of you, are welcome to. But this question is, how would the guests address the accusation that school choice programs are a way to resegregate schools? Who wants to go first?
I could take it real quick. Go ahead, Jeanette.
Just going to say that the data doesn't support that claim. Participation in school choice programs is generally consistent with or even higher on a percentage by minority students. So we have not seen that. That was a huge concern. That was a big talking point from the anti-school choice movement for a variety of programs, and the data simply does not support that.
Yeah, EdChoice says summarize the private school choice studies linking private school choice to racial integration, and all but one found positive integration effects, so the opposite of the claim. And that's because public schools are already racially segregated by race and by income. So allowing people to have more choice relative to that on net leads to more integration. And I'd also just want to point out that we shouldn't conflate segregation, something that was forced in the past in our country, with voluntary schooling selection. So there's a difference between voluntary selection and force that is absolutely ridiculous. I think we should talk about the forced nature of segregation different from individual moves, which could lead to stratification, which is much different. So for example, like a historically Black college and university, an HBCU, no one would say that was a segregated school, because it's an open choice by individual students, and no one would say that we should not allow these types of institutions at the higher education level. So similarly, I think we should talk about it a little differently, and we shouldn't really use the word segregation. We should use stratification, since it's voluntary.
Yeah, lastly, Brooke, I would also just add quickly to that. If that was the case, you'd see those numbers reflected in the views, in the opinions of African Americans and other minorities who've gone through the program. And obviously that would change, how they view the program, but that hasn't happened. As I said before, some of the highest support levels are amongst minorities, and obviously they don't reflect those views on segregation.
That's a really good indication that those claims are bupkis, to put it mildly. But okay, I've got one more question for each of you, and just would love to hear just quick answer, succinct, but also from the heart, y'all. So when it comes to education policy reform, how do you define success? And Bob, we'll start with you.
More families having more input into how and where their kids are educated, period.
Empowering families to make the best choice for their children.
I always like to say funding students instead of systems, so have the dollars follow the child to wherever they're getting an education, because it's meant for the education of the child. It's not meant for protecting a government monopoly. But to see if a system is working, I have a pretty quick rule of thumb for that is two questions. One, did you choose the provider of education, and did you like the provider of education? And that is success when it comes to educational services, just like any other industry or service in the economy as well.
Well, those are some excellent responses and insights, and I think they're helpful and valuable in terms of just understanding where we're at, the landscape, the nature of this lawsuit, but also education more generally, more meta, because I think really at the heart of this is, what is education? And so, there's the policy component, but there's some other components, and civil society has a role. But lest I get on my soapbox about this, we actually have to close because we are out of time. But we want to thank you all for joining us today. And if you have any follow-up questions, if you're watching this later, feel free to put them in the comment box below on Facebook. But to our panelists, thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, Jeanette. Thanks, Corey.
Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
Brooke. Thank you.